tablet CBS 10673, housed in the University of Pennsylvania Museum's Babylonian section, preserves the lower third of what scholars recognize as one of the earliest flood narratives from ancient Mesopotamia. This fragment, excavated from Nippur in 1896 during the Babylonian expedition's work at the site, contains 6 columns of text describing the creation of humans, the establishment of antediluvian cities under divine protection, and most significantly instructions for surviving a catastrophic deluge. The complete tablet would have contained approximately 260 lines based on reconstruction from preserved columns, each holding between 10 and 15 lines of text. Written in Sumerian and dating to approximately the 17th century BCE based on paleographic analysis and archaeological context, the tablet was classified by scholar Arno Pobel in 1914 as preserving the Eridu Genesis tradition. The preserved passages describe divine instructions for building cities under specific deities' protection, including the assignment of Eridu to Ea, the god of water. The text then recounts how Enki revealed the god's plan to destroy humanity through flood, warning King Ziusudra and urging him to construct a vessel for survival. Following 7 days and 7 nights of deluge, Ziusudra emerges to offer sacrifices, eventually receiving the gift of eternal life from the gods An and Enlil after Enki mollifies their fury. The narrative preserved on this and related tablets represents part of an extensive tradition of Mesopotamian creation and flood literature spanning nearly 2 millennia of cuneiform writing, distributed across multiple city-states, preserved in variant copies housed in museums from Philadelphia to Baghdad to Berlin. These texts describe divine beings creating humanity, the establishment of early cities under divine patronage, the proliferation of human civilization, divine dissatisfaction leading to catastrophic flood, and the survival of humanity through righteous individuals. While the Eridu Genesis focuses primarily on creation, cities, and flood, other Mesopotamian texts, including the Enki and Ninhursag myth, describe paradisiacal settings, and the Adapa tradition recounts tests involving consumption that determine mortal condition. The terminology, narrative structures, character types, and theological frameworks documented in these Mesopotamian tablets precede the biblical Genesis account by centuries, in some cases by over a millennium, raising fundamental questions about literary transmission, cultural influence, and the origins of one of Western civilization's most foundational narratives. The archaeological evidence establishes both the antiquity and the geographic distribution of these creation traditions through systematic excavation work conducted over more than a century. Excavations conducted by Hermann Hilprecht at Nippur between 1888 and 1900, representing the first major American archaeological expedition to Mesopotamia, uncovered tens of thousands of cuneiform tablets from what scholars would later recognize as the ancient city's temple library and scribal school complex. Hilprecht, working as part of the University of Pennsylvania's Babylonian expedition, excavated what he called Tablet Hill, describing the area as the whole area occupied by the large triangular mound was included in the temple library and school of the city. The Nippur excavations proceeded through 4 major expedition seasons, each lasting several months and involving considerable logistical challenges, given the remote location, harsh climate, and political complexities of working in Ottoman-controlled Iraq during the late 19th century. The first expedition in 1888 to 1889 established the basic parameters of the site and began the systematic recovery of tablets from the temple complex. Subsequent expeditions in 1889 to 1890, 1893 to 1896, and 1898 to 1900 expanded the excavation areas and recovered the majority of the approximately 30,000 tablets that now constitute the University of Pennsylvania Museum's Babylonian section, one of the 10 largest cuneiform collections in the world. Among these thousands of tablets were fragments of what scholars would later recognize as the Sumerian King List, a chronological document of profound importance for understanding ancient Mesopotamian historical consciousness. The King List places kingship's divine origins in the city of Eridu, designating it as the first city to receive the institution of kingship descended from heaven, and describes antediluvian rulers who reigned before a catastrophic flood that marks a fundamental transition in the Mesopotamian understanding of history. The document represents an attempt to create a comprehensive chronology linking mythological beginnings to historical dynasties, demonstrating sophisticated historical thinking in the early 2nd millennium BCE. Sir Leonard Woolley's excavations at Ur between 22 and 1934, conducted as a joint expedition of the British Museum and the University of Pennsylvania, revealed not only the spectacular artefacts from the Royal Cemetery that captured public imagination worldwide, but also textual and stratigraphic evidence relevant to understanding flood traditions. During the 1929 excavation season, Woolley sank a series of test shafts into the soil beneath the cemetery levels, discovering a distinctive clay layer approximately 2.5 metres thick that he initially interpreted as evidence of the Great Flood, described in both Mesopotamian and biblical literature. Woolley's dramatic announcement of discovering Noah's flood generated considerable publicity and scholarly debate. His interpretation rested on the observation that this sterile clay layer, devoid of artefacts or occupation debris, separated earlier archaeological levels from later developed urban phases, seemingly corresponding to the narrative of catastrophic inundation preserved in cuneiform flood texts. However, subsequent analysis by modern archaeologists using refined stratigraphic methods and more sophisticated understanding of depositional processes has substantially revised this interpretation. To Susan Pollock of the Free University of Berlin, among other specialists in Mesopotamian archaeology, conducted detailed reanalysis of Woolley's excavation records and stratigraphic sections in the 90s and 2000s. This work demonstrated that what Woolley interpreted as a single catastrophic flood deposit actually represented multiple layers of water-lane sediment interspersed with occupation debris, indicating not one massive inundation, but rather recurring cycles of flooding, abandonment, and reoccupation characteristic of lowland Mesopotamian settlement patterns. The clay layers span approximately 300 years between 2900 to 2600 BCE, based on ceramic typology and stratigraphic correlation with other sites in southern Mesopotamia. The revised understanding emerging from modern analysis suggests that while severe flooding did occur in ancient Mesopotamia, as the physical evidence clearly demonstrates, the archaeological record provides no indication of simultaneous disruption across the broader region that a universal flood would require. Instead, the evidence points to localized but devastating riverine floods affecting particular cities at particular times, precisely the kind of events that could generate cultural memories later incorporated into literary flood narratives. The gap between catastrophic local flooding and universal deluge illustrates the complex relationship between historical events and their literary representation in ancient texts. Fragments of the Eridu Genesis tradition are distributed across major museum collections worldwide. The British Museum, the Louvre, the Iraq Museum in Baghdad, the Oriental Institute in Chicago, and the Vorderasiatisches Museum in Berlin all house portions of related Sumerian creation and flood texts excavated from various Mesopotamian sites. These fragments, recovered from excavations spanning the mid-19th through early 20th centuries, derive from sites including Nippur, Ur, and other Sumerian cities, separated by distances of hundreds of kilometres. Dating analysis based on script paleography and archaeological stratigraphy places the majority of these tablets within the early 2nd millennium BCE, approximately 1900 to 1600 BCE. The fragmentary nature of preservation means that no single complete version survives. Individual fragments range from small pieces preserving only a few lines to more substantial portions containing multiple columns of text. Content consistency across fragments proves remarkable. Numerical sequences align. Terminology remains stable. Narrative elements follow identical progression. This consistency across tablets excavated independently, separated by decades of archaeological work from sites with no documented cultural contact during this period, suggests a standardized source text that achieved wide distribution throughout the Mesopotamian cultural sphere during the early 2nd millennium BCE. The question confronting researchers extends beyond simple acknowledgement of chronological priority. Mesopotamian creation narratives demonstrably predate biblical Genesis. This fact, established through stratigraphic analysis, ceramic typology, paleographic examination, and radiocarbon dating of organic materials trapped in tablet mortar, remains uncontested within mainstream archaeology and biblical scholarship. The interpretive challenge involves understanding the mechanisms of transmission, the nature of influence, the degree of direct literary dependence versus independent development of common mythological themes, and most fundamentally, the implications of this evidence for understanding how ancient Near Eastern peoples conceptualized human origins, divine human relationships, and humanity's place within the cosmic order. To approach these questions systematically requires examining the primary textual sources in detail, beginning with the earliest preserved Mesopotamian creation accounts and proceeding chronologically through the development of these traditions as documented in the cuneiform record. The Eridu-Genesis, named by Assyriologist Thorkild Jacobsen for the ancient city designated in the text as the first location of divine kingship, preserves the oldest complete Mesopotamian account linking creation, antediluvian civilization, and catastrophic flood in a unified narrative sequence. The composition dates to approximately 1600 BC in its written form, based on the script and archaeological context of surviving tablets, though the traditions it preserves appear considerably older. Scholars including William W. Hallow have examined references to flood traditions in earlier Ur-3 period texts from the 22nd to 21st centuries BCE, while Thorkild Jacobsen's seminal 1981 reconstruction suggests that the narrative likely draws from pre-Ur-3 oral traditions, with the story blending mytho-historical elements developed over time to legitimize Sumerian urban origins and explain the relationship between primordial and historical periods. The tablet was discovered during University of Pennsylvania excavations at Nippur, with the fragment now catalogued as CBS 10673 recovered in 1896. The significance of this text as a flood narrative was recognized through subsequent analysis, with Arno Poabel's 1914 publication providing comprehensive treatment of the Sumerian flood tradition preserved in this and related tablets. It is written in the Sumerian language and dated to around 1600 BCE, based on script paleography and archaeological context. The first 36 lines of the primary tablet from Nippur are lost. Based on the narrative structure of related texts and the content that follows, scholars infer that these missing lines likely addressed the creation of humans and animals, and possibly described humanity's existence prior to organized civilization, though the exact content remains uncertain. The surviving portion begins with a monologue from Nidtur, the goddess who birthed mankind, where she summons humans from a vagrant existence as nomads to build cities, establish temples, and become both sedentary and civilized. Following the monologue, another 36 lines are missing, resuming at a point where humans remain in a nomadic state. The content of this gap remains speculative, though some scholars have suggested it may have described stages in the development towards settled civilization. When the text resumes, Ninta is planning to provide kingship and organization to humans. Then the first cities are named, beginning with Eridu, whose leadership Ninta placed under the god Enki, followed by Bad Tibira, Larak Sipar, and Shuruppak. The narrative structure of the Eridu-Genesis demonstrates a tripartite organization uncommon in ancient Near Eastern mythological literature. The first section deals with creation and the establishment of civilization through divine instruction. The second describes antediluvian life and the genealogy of early rulers. The third recounts the flood catastrophe and humanity's renewal through the piety of King Ziusudra. Jacobsen noted that both the Eridu-Genesis and the biblical Genesis 1:9 arrange these segments along a linear timeline rather than grouping them around a folk hero, as is more common in ancient literature. This arrangement allows successive events to relate logically to each other as cause and effect. Such arrangements in literary compositions from the ancient world are sufficiently unusual that Jacobsen proposed a new genre designation, mytho-historical accounts. The text describes how humans began making noises that annoyed the gods. Enlil, master of the universe ruling from the cosmic freshwater ocean, was entirely unable to sleep due to this disturbance and made the decision to deal with this by destroying humanity with a flood. The god Enki, living in the lower part of the cosmic freshwater ocean, informs one human, Ziusudra, likely a priest, of this decision and advises him to build a boat to save both himself and representatives of every living creature. Ziusudra builds the boat, boards it with his family and the animals, and the gods unleash the flood. Mankind and the rest of life survives through Ziusudra's forewarned preparation. An element added in lines 258-261, not found in other versions, states that after the river flood subsided, the gods caused King Ziusudra to dwell in the land of the country of Dilmun, the place where the sun rises. In this version, Ziusudra's boat floats down the Euphrates River into the Persian Gulf rather than coming to rest on a mountain or upstream location. The Sumerian word Kur in related flood texts was interpreted to mean mountain in Akkadian translations, although in Sumerian, Kur carries multiple meanings including mountain, land, foreign country and underworld, creating ambiguity in geographical interpretation. Scholars including Kim San-hae have proposed that the Sumerian deluge story may correspond to localized river flooding events at Shuruppak, modern Tel Farah in Iraq, and cities extending north to Kish. This interpretation draws on archaeological evidence of a layer of riverine sediments, radiocarbon dated to approximately 2900 BCE, which interrupts the continuity of settlement at multiple sites, though whether this represents the historical basis for the flood narrative or simply contemporary flooding events remains debated. Polychrome pottery from the Jemdet Nazr period, circa 3000 to 2900 BCE, was discovered immediately below this Shuruppak flood stratum at multiple excavation sites. None of the pre-dynastic antediluvian rulers described in the Eridu Genesis have been verified as historical by archaeological excavations, epigraphical inscriptions, or other independent evidence, though the Sumerians purported them to have lived in a mythical era before the Great Deluge. The historical basis for the flood in the Eridu Genesis remains contested, with possible links to real Mesopotamian inundations, but no scholarly consensus on a literal cataclysmic event of the scope described in the text. The parallels between the Eridu Genesis and biblical Genesis extend beyond simple structural similarity. Both narratives describe divine dissatisfaction with human behavior leading to catastrophic punishment. Both preserve humanity through the righteousness of a single individual warned by a benevolent deity. Both describe post-flood renewal and the re-establishment of divine human covenant relationships. Both link creation, civilization, and flood in a chronological sequence that explains present human conditions through primordial events. These correspondences have been noted by scholars since the late 19th century, intensifying with George Smith's 1876 translation of flood accounts from the Library of Ashurbanipal and subsequent discoveries of earlier Sumerian versions. The interpretive question involves whether these parallels indicate direct literary borrowing, common cultural memory of actual historical events, independent development of universal mythological themes, or some combination of these factors. Conventional scholarly interpretation, established through the work of Samuel Noah Kramer, Thorkild Jacobson, and subsequent Assyriologists, treats the similarities as suggesting cultural transmission from Mesopotamian to Hebrew tradition. Proposed mechanisms for such transmission include mediation through Canaanite intermediaries during the 2nd millennium BCE, given documented cuneiform literary circulation in Canaan, or alternatively, direct Israelite contact with Mesopotamian culture during the Babylonian exile in the 6th century BCE, though the relative contribution of each pathway remains debated. This interpretation rests on chronological priority, the documented influence of Mesopotamian literature on other ancient Near Eastern cultures, and the absence of evidence for Hebrew literary tradition before the late 2nd millennium BCE. Alternative interpretations note that chronological priority does not necessarily establish causation, that common mythological themes appear in geographically and temporally isolated cultures suggesting universal human responses to fundamental questions about origins, and that the theological and philosophical frameworks of Mesopotamian and biblical creation narratives differ sufficiently to suggest independent traditions adapted to distinct cultural contexts. These alternative readings emphasize the radical monotheism of Genesis versus the polytheistic framework of Mesopotamian texts, the moral and ethical dimensions of the biblical account versus the primarily cosmological focus of Mesopotamian versions, and the dignity accorded to humanity in Genesis versus the utilitarian view of human creation in Mesopotamian literature. The textual evidence, however, reveals additional layers of complexity that resist reduction to simple models of either direct borrowing or complete independence. The Atrahasis epic, dated to the 17th century BCE based on colophons from Old Babylonian copies, provides the most detailed Mesopotamian account of human creation from divine materials. The oldest known copy of the epic tradition can be dated by colophon to the reign of Hammurabi's great-grandson, Ammi Saduqa, who ruled approximately 1646 to 1626 BCE. Various Old Babylonian dialect fragments exist, including versions recovered from Ugarit on the Levantine coast, and the epic continued to be copied into the first millennium BCE, demonstrating its enduring significance within Mesopotamian literary tradition across more than a millennium. The story exists in Assyrian dialect versions rediscovered in the library of Ashurbanipal at Nineveh during excavations conducted by British archaeologists Austin Henry Layard in the 1840s and Hormuzd Rassam in the 1850s. The library itself, belonging to the Neo-Assyrian king Ashurbanipal, who reigned 68 to 627 BCE, contained thousands of cuneiform tablets systematically collected from across Mesopotamia as part of a conscious effort to preserve literary and scholarly traditions. The Atrahasis fragments from this library, though in fragmentary condition and containing ambiguous terminology due to damage and the inherent difficulties of Akkadian lexicography, were first assembled and translated by George Smith as The Chaldean Account of Genesis in 18. The hero's name was corrected from Smith's initial reading to Atrahasis by Heinrich Zimmern in 1899 through improved understanding of Akkadian orthography. The manuscripts consist of fragmentary cuneiform clay tablets recovered from archaeological sites across ancient Mesopotamia, primarily during 19th century British excavations conducted under often difficult and dangerous conditions in what was then the Ottoman Empire. Key fragments include Old Babylonian versions from the early 2nd millennium BCE, representing the earliest substantial witnesses to the composition, alongside later Neo-Assyrian duplicates that preserve portions of the narrative through copies made for Ashurbanipal's library collection. The existence of copies separated by over 1,000 years of transmission history demonstrates both the care with which scribes preserved these traditions and the cultural continuity of Mesopotamian civilization across dynastic and linguistic changes. The British Museum houses the most complete version, with tablets catalogued as BM 78941, BM 78942, and BM 1889-0426-236, representing different sections of the original 3-tablet composition. These tablets were acquired through excavations at Sippar in southern Iraq, ancient Sippar being one of the oldest and most important Sumerian and Babylonian cities, located on the Euphrates River northwest of Babylon. The excavations at Sippar, conducted between 1880 and 1890 under the direction of Hormuzd Rassam, working on behalf of the British Museum, uncovered thousands of tablets from the temple complex of the sun god Shamash, including these crucial witnesses to the Atrahasis tradition. The tablets are inscribed in Akkadian cuneiform, the Semitic language that served as the lingua franca of the ancient Near East for over 2 millennia. BM 78941 preserves significant portions of the creation account from tablet Beerwan, allowing scholars to reconstruct substantial sections of the narrative despite the fragmentary nature of preservation. Dating analysis places these particular tablets to approximately 1750 to 1650 BCE, based on paleographic features, including specific sign forms that evolved systematically over time and archaeological context, derived from stratigraphic position within the temple archive where they were discovered. A remarkable achievement of modern scholarship involved the virtual reconstruction of fragmentary tablets using advanced imaging technologies. Research conducted in recent years employed 3D photogrammetry to create detailed digital models of fragments. This work confirmed that fragments housed separately in the British Museum and the Musée d'Art et d'Histoire in Geneva derive from the same original tablet, resolving a question that had persisted for over 50 years regarding whether these pieces could be joined. The curator Irving Finkel of the British Museum had noted decades earlier that the crucial episode about the Ark and the Flood occurs in Epik Aya's tablet the Thi. This tablet is now in 2 pieces. The larger, known as C1, might just possibly join with C2 if they could ever be manoeuvred into the same room, but the former is in the British Museum and the latter in the Musée d'Art et d'Histoire in Geneva. The digital reconstruction confirmed the match without requiring physical proximity of the fragments, demonstrating how modern technology enables new forms of textual scholarship. The Atrahasis epic begins with an organizational framework describing the divine hierarchy governing the cosmos. Heaven is ruled by the god Anu, the earth by Enlil, and the subterranean Sweetwater by Enki, known in Akkadian as Ea. This tripartite cosmic structure reflects Mesopotamian cosmological understanding documented across multiple texts from different periods. Within this structure, the text explains that minor gods, the Agigi, initially performed the labour of maintaining the earth, digging canals, clearing rivers, and cultivating fields. After 330 years of this toil described in Tablet 1, the Igigi rebel against their labour, declaring the gods' load was too great, the work too hard, the trouble too much. The gods convene an assembly to address this crisis. The solution proposed involves the creation of a new category of being designed specifically to bear the labour burden. The god Ea, whose Sumerian equivalent was Enki and who possessed wisdom and creative capacity, collaborates with the birth goddess Belet Ili, also known as Nintu or Ninhursag, to fashion humanity from a mixture of clay and divine blood. The text states in lines 221, following from Tablet Wain, that man was created from the flesh and blood of a slaughtered god mixed with clay. Specifically, the god Wei-Ila, identified as one of the rebellious Igigi, is slaughtered, and his blood is mixed with clay to create the first humans. This account of human creation from divine blood and earthly clay represents what scholar William L. Moran described in E70 as the most important single witness to Babylonian speculation on the origins and nature of man, particularly the description of creation in the first tablet of the Atrahasis epic, especially lines 192-248. In 1977, A.R. Millard noted that the Atrahasis epic is more specific on the making of man than any other Babylonian creation account. The dual nature of humanity emphasized in this text, possessing both earthly constituency through the clay and divine essence through the god's blood, parallels the biblical account in Genesis 2:7, which states that the Lord God formed man from the dust of the ground and breathed into his nostrils the breath of life, making man a living being. The earthly component receives emphasis in both Babylonian and Hebrew narratives, yet the Mesopotamian text makes explicit what Genesis leaves implicit. The divine element within humanity derives from literal divine substance, the blood of a sacrificed deity. No hint of the use of a dead deity or any material part of a living one appears in Genesis, where the divine element enters through breath rather than blood, through animation rather than incorporation. This distinction proves significant for understanding the theological frameworks of the two traditions. In the Mesopotamian account, humanity contains literal divine material, creating an ontological connection between gods and humans that the biblical account carefully avoids through its emphasis on the image of God as a quality or function rather than a shared substance. The purpose of human creation in the Atrahasis epic contrasts sharply with the Genesis account. Humanity in the Mesopotamian text exists to relieve the gods of hard labour by supplying them with food and drink through agricultural production, mahon, and temple offerings. This utilitarian view of human purpose was standard among both Sumerians and Babylonians, as documented across multiple texts, including the opening section of the Atrahasis epic. Lambert and Millard noted in their 1969 analysis that the idea that man was created to relieve the gods of hard labour by supplying them with food and drink was standard among both Sumerians and Babylonians. In Genesis, by contrast, humanity receives creation in the image of God, blessed with dominion over the earth, instructed to be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth. The purpose involves stewardship, relationship, and reflection of divine qualities rather than servitude. This fundamental difference in anthropology, in the understanding of what humanity is and why humanity exists, distinguishes the biblical tradition from its Mesopotamian antecedents despite surface narrative similarities. The Atrahasis epic proceeds to describe the proliferation of humanity following creation. Approximately 100 years after inception, the population expands to the point where the country became too wide, the people too numerous, resulting in widespread clamour that echoes like a bellow-enjoying bull. This incipient noise, termed Rigmu and Huburu in Akkadian, meaning clamour and tumult, penetrates the divine realm, particularly irritating Enlil, the god of earth and chief executive among the Anunnaki gods. Enlil, deprived of sleep, declares the noise of mankind has become too much, and determines to reduce the human population. Enlil's initial response involves sending plague to decimate humanity. The god Ea, however, thwarts this by instructing his human devotee Atrahasis to cease worship of other gods and focus offerings exclusively to Namtar, the plague god, thereby appeasing the deity and ending the epidemic. When the population recovers and the noise resumes, Enlil escalates to famine, ordering Adad to withhold rain, blocking the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, and halting vegetation growth under Nisaba's domain. This leads to 6 years of severe starvation, where the text describes faces becoming encrusted with hunger and cries echoing anew. Ea again thwarts the decree indirectly through Atra Hasis, advising rituals by the riverbank and possibly subterranean water access or grain provision, which alleviates the drought without fully defying the divine order. These initial punishments highlight the epic's portrayal of human excess as a causal irritant to the gods, with Ea's subversive aid preserving mankind temporarily while foreshadowing escalation toward a final solution. The pattern of divine frustration, punishment, human survival through divine assistance, and renewed growth creating renewed frustration establishes a cycle that can only be broken through more extreme measures. Tablet 3 of the Atra Hasis epic describes Enlil's ultimate solution, a catastrophic flood designed to destroy humanity entirely. Enlil binds the other gods by oath not to reveal his plan to humans. However, Ea, bound by the oath not to speak directly to humans, finds a loophole by speaking to the wall of Atra Hasis' house, knowing that Atra Hasis will overhear. Ea instructs Atra Hasis to demolish his house, disregard possessions, save his life, build a boat, and bring aboard seeds of all living things. The description of the flood in the Atra Hasis epic parallels later accounts in the Epic of Gilgamesh and the biblical Noah narrative. When Adad gathered the clouds and winds began to roar from all ends of the world, Atra Hasis and at least one fertile woman climbed into the ship and sealed its entrance hatch from inside with pitch. The ark swirled like a pot on the waves of the mighty flood thundering down from the open floodgates of the cosmic primordial ocean. Enlil's fury at his foiled plan to destroy mankind contrasts with the suffering of the other gods, who experience hunger because they can no longer find humans to feed them with offerings. The gods cry at the immense destruction, and the goddess Mami, identified with Belet Ili, raises accusations against Enlil for destroying humans instead of punishing only the rebellious among them. After the flood subsides, Atra Hasis emerges and makes an offering to the gods. The deities, who had been starved during the flood, gather around the offering like flies, grateful for the resumption of worship and provision. The narrative ends with Enlil accepting the existence and usefulness of humans, though the text contains gaps at this crucial point. The resolution appears to involve population control measures other than total destruction, including the introduction of certain classes of women who do not bear children, infant mortality, and possibly the institution of death itself as a check on unlimited population growth. The name Atra Hasis, meaning exceedingly wise, first appears on the Sumerian king list as a ruler of Shuruppak in the times before the flood, demonstrating the integration of this figure into broader Mesopotamian historical mythological frameworks. Copies of the story have survived from the 17th to the 7th century BCE, showing that it was copied and recopied over the centuries, maintaining its cultural significance across different periods and empires. This demonstrates both the text's importance within Mesopotamian literary tradition and the mechanisms of textual preservation and transmission that allowed ancient narratives to influence later compositions across centuries. The connection between the Atra Hasis epic and biblical Genesis extends beyond the flood narrative to encompass fundamental questions about human nature and purpose. Both texts describe humans fashioned from earthly materials animated by divine essence. Both place humanity in a special relationship to the divine realm. Both describe divine dissatisfaction with human behavior leading to catastrophic punishment mitigated by divine mercy toward a righteous individual. Yet the theological frameworks diverge fundamentally in their understanding of why humans exist, what relationship they bear to the divine, and what cosmic order they inhabit. The question of direct literary borrowing remains contested. Two aspects of Atra Hasis were adopted in the Epic of Gilgamesh around 1200 BCE. The primal scene of extended mating between a man and a woman, and the Foi, devastating deluge. The Old Testament probably also referred to these themes, with the former appearing as Adam and Eve's creation and the latter as the biblical flood narrative. The principle of divine creativity remains common to all three narratives. However, while the Sumerian originals attribute creative power to a multitude of strongly anthropomorphic gods similar to those of ancient Greece, organized in political structures with competing agendas and human-like motivations, the biblical version reduces this politically organized pantheon to the singular god of monotheism, creating humanity not from practical necessity but from purposeful design. This transition from polytheistic to monotheistic frameworks represents more than simple theological evolution. It reflects fundamentally different understandings of cosmic order, divine nature, and human purpose that distinguish biblical tradition from its Mesopotamian context despite undeniable literary connections. The relationship between Mesopotamian creation narratives and the biblical Genesis account that becomes more complex when examining accounts that predate the Atrahasis epic and describe not just human creation generally, but the creation of specific individuals who parallel the biblical Adam in both name and narrative function. The Adapa myth, preserved in fragmentary form across multiple tablets excavated from different Mesopotamian sites spanning considerable geographic and temporal distances, describes a figure created by the god E, known in Sumerian as Enki, as the first wise man of Eridu, the city traditionally regarded as the oldest urban centre in Mesopotamia. The myth survives in several versions and fragments that together allow partial reconstruction of the narrative, though significant gaps remain. The most substantial textual witnesses derive from four main Akkadian sources, designated by scholars as fragments A, B, C, and D, following conventional scholarly notation for fragmentary cuneiform. Texts. Fragment A, part of the extensive cuneiform archive discovered at Tel El Amarna in Egypt, dates to the 14th century BCE during the period when Egyptian pharaohs maintained diplomatic correspondence with Near Eastern rulers using Akkadian as the diplomatic language. The Amarna archive, discovered in the 1880s and containing correspondence between Egyptian administration and various Near Eastern kingdoms, included not only letters but also literary texts, suggesting that Mesopotamian literature circulated widely across the ancient Near Eastern world as part of scribal education. The presence of the Adapa text at Amarna indicates that this narrative enjoyed sufficient cultural prestige to warrant copying and transmission beyond Mesopotamia proper. Fragments C and D derive from the library of Ashurbanipal at Nineveh, dating to the 7th century BCE, representing copies made as part of Ashurbanipal's systematic collection of Mesopotamian literary and scholarly traditions. The fragments, though separated from the Amarna version by approximately 7 centuries, preserve overlapping portions of the narrative with sufficient correspondence to enable reconstruction of the story's basic outline despite variations in specific details. The fact that copies were made across such temporal distance testifies to the narrative's enduring significance within cuneiform literary culture. Additional variants appear in smaller fragments from other Mesopotamian sites, indicating the myth's dissemination across Mesopotamian-influenced regions during the Late Bronze Age. The geographic distribution of these fragments, extending from Egypt in the west to various Mesopotamian cities in the east, demonstrates patterns of cultural exchange and literary circulation that characterize the ancient Near Eastern world during the 2nd and 1st millennia BCE. Sumerian fragments, including a relatively well-preserved version from Tel Hadad, ancient Meturan, dated to the 19th, 16th centuries BCE based on archaeological context and paleographic analysis, provide earlier attestations of the tale in what may be its original linguistic context, though the relationship between Sumerian and Akkadian versions of the story remains debated. Two smaller pieces from Nippur, the great religious centre of Sumer where American excavations uncovered thousands of literary and scholarly tablets, add additional textual witnesses, though their fragmentary state limits their contribution to understanding the narrative's development. The discovery of these sources began with 19th century excavations at Nineveh, where British archaeologists Austin Henry Layard in the 1840s and Hormuzd Rassam in the 1850s unearthed thousands of tablets from Ashurbanipal's library, including the Adapa fragments A, C and D, amid the site's systematic exploration starting in 1845. George Smith, working at the British Museum, continued excavations in the 1870s and provided the first modern translations of these Nineveh pieces in his 1876 publication The Chaldean Account of Genesis, identifying them as part of a creation narrative tradition predating the biblical account. The Adapa myth describes how the god Ea created Adapa and endowed him with vast intelligence and wisdom but deliberately withheld immortality. Adapa served as king of Eridu, and according to the text, went fishing one day in the Persian Gulf when the south wind suddenly capsized his boat and hurled him into the sea. Furious at this treatment, Adapa broke the wing of the south wind, and for 7 days the wind could not blow. The sky god Anu, noting the absence of the south wind, summoned Adapa to explain himself and account for his behaviour. Adapa received counsel from his creator god Ea on how he should behave in the court of the gods. The text describes Ea instructing Adapa to mourn before the heavenly gatekeepers Tammuz and Gishida, identified in the text as Ea's younger sons, telling them that he mourned their absence from Earth. If Adapa honoured them properly, they would speak favourably of him to Anu. More critically, Ea warned Adapa that when he came before Anu, he would be offered the bread of death and the water of death as punishment for breaking the south wind's wing, and therefore he must refuse any food or drink offered. However, Ea advised Adapa could accept oil for anointing and accept whatever clothing was offered. Adapa followed Ea's instructions precisely. He respectfully honoured Tammuz and Gishida at Heaven's Gate, and they indeed spoke favourably of him to Anu. Anu, impressed by Adapa's wisdom and moved by the intercession of the gatekeepers, decided not to punish Adapa but instead to offer him the kshos, food and drink of eternal life intending to make him immortal. However, Adapa, trusting Ea's advice, refused the food and drink offered, though he accepted the oil for anointing, and put on the robe presented to him. Anu, puzzled that the man should refuse the food and drink of life and the gift of immortality, sent Adapa back to Earth, where he must live out his life as a mortal. The interpretation of this myth has generated scholarly debate regarding Ea's motivation and the nature of the test Adapa faced. The conventional reading, established through early 20th century translations, understood Ea as deliberately deceiving Adapa to prevent him from achieving divine status, and thus maintaining the distinction between gods and humans. According to this interpretation, similar to Yahweh's reasoning in Genesis when, after Adam and Eve eat from the tree of knowledge of good and evil, Yahweh cast them out before they can also eat of the tree of life, Ea feared that if Adapa possessed both wisdom and immortality, he would become the equal of the gods, resulting in a loss of status and hierarchy. Shlomo Israel's 2001 edition and analysis argues for an alternative interpretation, suggesting that Ea's role emphasizes Adapa's wisdom and cultic duties as a servant, with protective intent that preserves human limits while granting intellectual elevation, rather than malicious deception. This view contrasts with earlier interpretations that saw Ea as tricking Adapa to prevent divine equality, a perspective critiqued in subsequent studies for overlooking the myth's ritualistic context. The text remains ambiguous regarding Ea's knowledge of what Anu would actually offer, whether Ea genuinely believed Anu would serve the food and drink of death, or whether Ea understood Anu's intention but deliberately misinformed Adapa to ensure he remained mortal. Despite interpretive disagreements about divine motivation, the narrative parallels between Adapa and the biblical Adam proves striking enough to warrant detailed comparative analysis. Both figures were created as the first wise man by a creator deity. Both were endowed with wisdom and knowledge. Both underwent a test involving consumption of specific food or drink. Both failed the test, though through opposite actions. Adam ate what was forbidden, while Adapa refused what was offered. Both forfeited immortality as a result of their actions during the test. Both became the progenitors or representatives of mortal humanity. The consequences of their failures passed to all subsequent humans. The linguistic connection between the names Adapa and Adam has attracted scholarly attention. Some researchers have noted that phonetic transformations in early Semitic languages could potentially relate these names, particularly given patterns of consonant interchange in related language families, though this connection remains speculative and is not accepted by mainstream philology. The significance of the name similarity, if any exists beyond coincidence, continues to be debated, with many scholars arguing that the parallels in narrative structure and function prove more significant than any potential etymological relationship. More significant than the name parallels are the structural and thematic correspondences. Dr. Yitzhak Meitlis of Bar Ilan University identified 5 key parallels in his 1977 analysis. Both subjects underwent a test before the deity based upon something they were to consume. Both failed the test and thereby forfeited their opportunity for immortality. As a result of their failure, certain consequences passed upon mankind. Both subjects qualify as members of the first generation of mankind, and their names can be equated linguistically under certain phonetic transformations. These parallels have led various scholars to propose different models of relationship between the Adapa myth and the biblical Adam narrative. Some interpret the similarities as evidence that the Genesis account drew directly on earlier Mesopotamian traditions, adapting the Adapa story to monotheistic theology. Others suggest both narratives derive from a common, older tradition now lost, with Mesopotamian and Hebrew versions representing independent developments from this shared source. Still others argue that the parallels reflect universal mythological themes about human origins and mortality that emerge independently in different cultures rather than indicating literary dependence. The theological differences between the two narratives complicate simple models of direct borrowing. In the Oedipus myth, the creator deity Ea deliberately withholds immortality from his creation and actively deceives him to ensure he remains mortal. There is no moral dimension to Oedipus' failure. He acts with perfect obedience to the deity who created him. The tragedy results not from rebellion or sin, but from the structural inequality between gods and humans, with divine deception ensuring the maintenance of that hierarchy. In Genesis, by contrast, Adam receives creation with access to the tree of life, and his loss of immortality results from moral transgression, from choosing knowledge against divine command, creating fundamentally different anthropological and theological frameworks. Yet these differences may represent adaptive transformation of a received tradition rather than independent origin. The monotheistic framework of Genesis necessitates different theological explanations than the polytheistic Mesopotamian context. Where the Mesopotamian tradition can depict gods in conflict, with Ea working against Anu's intentions, the monotheistic Genesis must attribute both creation and consequence to the singular god, requiring moral rather than political explanations for humanity's mortal condition. The question of whether the Genesis account represents conscious literary adaptation of Mesopotamian traditions or independent development sharing common themes remains contested. What appears established through textual analysis and archaeological evidence is that Mesopotamian narratives describing a created first man, texts involving consumption, and the determination of human mortality predate the biblical Genesis account by centuries and circulated widely enough to influence multiple ancient Near Eastern cultures through various transmission mechanisms. The examination of these creation narratives reveals additional complexity when considering traditions that describe not just the creation of humanity generally, or specific first humans, but the establishment of paradisiacal settings, where these first humans dwelt before catastrophe or transgression altered their condition. The Sumerian myth. Enki and Ninhursag describes events in the land of Dilmun, identified in the text as a pure, clean, and bright land of the living, described through poetic language as the garden of the great gods and an earthly paradise existing in a primordial state. The text of Enki and Ninhursag, a Sumerian paradise myth, is based primarily on a fairly well-preserved tablet excavated at Nippur during the University of Pennsylvania expeditions, now housed in the University Museum's Babylonian section. It was copied and published by Stephen Langdon, an early Assyriologist working in the first decades of the 20th century, under the title The Sumerian Epic of Paradise, the Flood, and the Fall of Man, in the series Publications of the Babylonian Section, Volume 10, Part 1, released in 1915. The tablet itself represents one of thousands of literary compositions preserved in the temple library at Nippur, which served as the major religious and educational centre of ancient Sumer. The scribal school at Nippur trained generations of scribes in the art of cuneiform writing, Sumerian language and literature, and the mathematical and astronomical knowledge necessary for temple administration and royal service. Literary compositions including creation myths, hymns to deities, royal inscriptions, and wisdom literature formed core curriculum materials that students copied repeatedly as part of their training, ensuring the preservation and transmission of Sumerian literary traditions across centuries. The composition describes Dilmun as existing in a primordial state before the full organization of creation had been completed, a theme that appears in various Mesopotamian creation accounts, where the cosmos undergoes progressive organization from initial chaos or undifferentiated matter to ordered reality. The opening lines establish the setting through repetitive parallelism characteristic of Sumerian poetry. Pure is Dilmun land, virginal is Dilmun land, pristine is Dilmun land. This threefold repetition emphasizes the untouched, sacred nature of this paradisiacal realm, setting it apart from the ordinary world of human experience. The text continues describing Dilmun as a place where the typical afflictions of human existence remain absent, creating a utopian vision that contrasts sharply with the reality of life in ancient Mesopotamia, where disease, aging and death constituted unavoidable aspects of existence. The text states, "No eye disease is said there. I am the eye disease. No headache said there. I am the headache. No old woman belonging to it said there. I'm an old woman. No old man belonging to it that said there. I'm an old man." This personification of diseases and the emphasis on absence of aging creates a picture of paradisiacal existence free from disease, pain, aging and death, elements that scholars have noted parallel biblical descriptions of Eden before the fall introduced suffering and mortality into human experience. The specific mention of diseases reflects the medical concerns of ancient Mesopotamia, where eye diseases pose particular problems in the harsh climate with its dust, strong sunlight and limited medical interventions. The explicit mention of aging and its absence in Dilmun emphasises the contrast between this primordial paradise and ordinary human experience, where aging inevitably leads to decline and death. The paradise described exists outside normal temporal progression, suspended in eternal youth and health. Samuel Noah Kramer, the pioneering Sumerologist whose work in the mid-20th century established much of the foundation for modern understanding of Sumerian literature, devoted particular attention to analysing the parallels between this Sumerian paradise myth and the biblical Eden narrative. Kramer's 1963 book, The Sumerians, Their History, Culture and Character, included detailed comparative analysis demonstrating numerous correspondences in theme, motif and narrative structure, though he carefully noted the significant theological differences that distinguish the monotheistic biblical account from its polytheistic Mesopotamian context. The location of Dilmun has generated scholarly debate since Sir Henry Rawlinson first suggested in 1880 that it corresponded to Bahrain. Friedrich Delitzsch promoted this theory in his 1881 book Wolag das Paradies, suggesting that Dilmun was situated at the head of the Persian Gulf. Archaeological and textual evidence has led most scholars to identify Dilmun with the region of Bahrain and the eastern Arabian coast, though the precise geographic reference may have shifted over time, with Dilmun potentially designating different locations in different periods. Various theories have placed Dilmun in different locations throughout the Arabian Peninsula and Mesopotamian littoral based on trade records, geographical descriptions in texts, and archaeological correlations. The Eridogenesis states that after the flood, King Ziusudra was caused to dwell in the land of the country of Dilmun, the place where the sun rises, a phrase that could indicate an eastern location relative to Sumer, which some scholars have noted bears resemblance to Genesis's description of Eden as located eastward in Eden, though the geographic correlation remains uncertain. Dilmun in the Enki and Ninhursag myth initially exists as a waterless land. The text describes how Enki, the god of wisdom and fresh water, and Utu, the sun god, cooperate to bring life-giving water to Dilmun. Enki causes water to rise up from the earth. The waters rose up from it into her great basins. Her city drank water aplenty from them. Dilmun drank water aplenty from them. This process of water emerging from the earth to irrigate the land parallels the Genesis 2:6 description. There went up a mist from the earth and watered the whole face of the ground. The narrative then describes sexual encounters between Enki and the goddess Ninhursag, the earth mother also known as Ninta, and various other names. Enki impregnates Ninhursag, who gives birth to the goddess Ninmu. The text specifies that Ninhursag gives birth easily and without pain, contrasting with the curse upon Eve in Genesis 3:16 to give birth in pain as punishment for eating the forbidden fruit. Enki then impregnates his daughter Ninmu, who bears Ninkura. Enki impregnates Ninkura, who bears Utu. At this point in the narrative, Ninhursag realizes what Enki is doing and intervenes to protect her great-granddaughter Utu. She instructs Utu to refuse Enki's advances unless he brings her cucumbers, apples, and grapes as gifts. Enki, discovering this requirement, brings the fruit and succeeds in seducing Utu. Following this union, Ninhursag becomes enraged. She takes Enki's semen from Utu's womb before conception can occur and uses it to cause 8 plants to grow in Dilmun, which she explicitly forbids Enki to eat. Enki, accompanied by his vizier Isimud, encounters these 8 plants. When he asks Isimud what they are, Isimud plucks each plant and hands it to Enki, who eats them all, determining their nature and destiny. Ninhursag, discovering that Enki has consumed all 8 forbidden plants, turns upon him the Eye of Death, curses him, and departs from paradise, declaring that she will no longer dwell in the same place as Enki. The The consumption of forbidden plants in paradise leading to divine curse and expulsion parallels the Genesis narrative of Adam and Eve eating forbidden fruit, resulting in curse and expulsion from Eden. The differences prove equally significant. In the Mesopotamian account, the prohibition comes from a goddess rather than from the supreme deity. The consumption results from curiosity about the plant's nature rather than moral transgression, and the curse falls upon the one who ate rather than extending to all humanity. Nevertheless, the narrative pattern of paradise, forbidden food, consumption, curse, and separation from the divine realm establishes a template remarkably similar to Genesis' structure. Following the curse, Enki becomes gravely ill and begins dying. The other gods mourn, but none can heal him except Ninhursag, and she cannot be found, having withdrawn from the divine realm in her anger. A fox, described in the text through fragmentary lines, convinces Ninhursag to return and save Enki, arguing that if Enki dies, representing as he does all fresh water necessary for life, then life itself will end. Ninhursag agrees to return and heal Enki. The healing process described in the text establishes one of the most significant connections between Mesopotamian and biblical traditions. Ninhursag orders Enki to lie with his head against her vulva and to name each body part causing him pain. For each part he names, she gives birth to a deity to heal that specific affliction. The text records this dialogue. "Brother, what hurts you? My skull hurts me. I have caused a boo to be born for you. Brother, what hurts you? My jaw hurts me. I have caused Nintulla to be born for you. Brother, what hurts you? My tooth hurts me. I have caused Ninsutu to be born for you. Brother, what hurts you? My mouth hurts me. I have caused Ninkasi to be born for you. Brother, what hurts you? My throat hurts me. I have caused Nutsi to be born for you. Brother, what hurts you? My arm hurts me. I have caused a Zemua to be born for you. Brother, what hurts you? My rib hurts me. I have caused Ninti to be born for you." The goddess created for healing Enki's rib is called Ninti in Sumerian, a name whose significance extends beyond simple designation to encompass wordplay that may illuminate one of the most puzzling aspects of the biblical Genesis narrative. Analysis of this name reveals that the Sumerian word ti carries dual meaning within the language's semantic structure. It functions both as the term for rib, the curved bone protecting vital organs, and as a verb meaning to make live or to give life, creating an inherent ambiguity that ancient Sumerian poets exploited for literary effect. Thus, Ninti can be accurately translated as both the lady of the rib in its anatomical sense and the lady who makes live in its life-giving sense. These two designations, though semantically distinct in other languages, merge in Sumerian through this ancient literary pun or wordplay, representing one of the earliest documented examples of deliberate linguistic ambiguity employed for theological purpose. Samuel Noah Kramer identified this connection to the biblical Eve narrative through detailed philological analysis published in his seminal 1963 work, building on decades of research approach into Sumerian language and literature. Kramer's analysis addresses what he characterizes as one of the most puzzling motifs in the biblical paradise story, the famous passage describing the fashioning of Eve, designated the mother of all living, from the rib of Adam. Kramer poses the central interpretive question: for why a rib? Why did the Hebrew storyteller find it more fitting to choose a rib rather than any other organ of the body for the fashioning of the woman whose name, Eve, according to the biblical notion, means approximately she who makes live? The puzzle deepens when one considers that no obvious anatomical or symbolic logic connects the rib specifically to life-giving or motherhood in Hebrew thought or in most other cultural contexts. The rib serves a protective function in human anatomy, shielding heart and lungs, but carries no particular association with reproduction, birth, or the generation of life. The choice appears arbitrary unless one understands the literary tradition from which it may derive. Kramer continues his analysis by proposing a solution grounded in cross-cultural textual transmission. The reason becomes quite clear if we assume a Sumerian literary background, such as that represented by our Dilmun poem, to underlie the biblical paradise tale. For in our Sumerian poem, one of Enki's sick organs is the rib. The goddess created for the healing of the rib is called Ninti, the lady of the rib. But the Sumerian word ti also means to make live. The name Ninti may thus mean the lady who makes live as well as the lady of the rib. In Sumerian literature, therefore, the Lady of the Rib came to be identified with the Lady who makes live through what may be termed a play on words. The literary mechanism Kramer identifies involves the preservation of narrative motif across linguistic boundaries despite the loss of the wordplay that originally gave the motif meaning. He concludes, "It was this, one of the most ancient of literary puns, which was carried over and perpetuated in the biblical paradise story, although there, of course, the pun loses its validity, since the Hebrew words for rib, tsela, and who makes live, chava, from which Eve derives, have nothing in common. The Hebrew word tsela, meaning rib or side, shares no phonetic or semantic relationship with shava, the root of Eve's name meaning to live or to give life. The connection that works seamlessly in Sumerian through the dual meaning of ti becomes inexplicable in Hebrew when translated directly, unless one understands it as the fossilized remnant of an earlier tradition where the connection made linguistic sense. This observation carries significant implications for understanding the transmission of literary traditions across cultures and languages. The preservation of the rib motif in Genesis, despite the absence of the linguistic foundation that originally justified its inclusion, suggests that Hebrew scribes worked from received narrative traditions whose origins they may not have fully understood, or whose deeper meanings had been lost in transmission. The fact that Eve receives designation as mother of all living, while also being fashioned from a rib, creates a connection that appears meaningful but remains unexplained within the Hebrew text itself, a connection that only becomes clear when traced back to its Sumerian antecedent, where the linguistic ambiguity creates inherent meaning. The scholarly interpretation of this connection has generated discussion regarding the mechanisms and pathways of cultural transmission in the ancient Near East. Thorkild Jacobson, colleague and contemporary of Kramer, and other specialists in Sumerian literature have noted that this connection represents only one among souls. Numerous parallels between the Dilmun paradise myth and the Eden story, suggesting broader patterns of literary influence rather than isolated borrowing of specific motifs. These parallels include the setting in a divine paradise described as a garden and placed in an eastern location, the provision of fresh water brought up from the earth to irrigate previously arid land, the description of birth occurring without pain or travail in the paradisiacal state, which illuminates the background of the curse pronounced against Eve that she shall conceive and bear children in sorrow following the transgression, the consumption of forbidden plants by a divine or semi-divine figure leading to curse and separation from paradise, and the overall narrative pattern of paradise, prohibition, violation, curse, and altered condition. Each parallel invites analysis regarding whether it indicates direct literary borrowing, adaptation through intermediary traditions, common cultural memory of actual events or practices, or independent development of universal mythological themes. The rib-life connection, however, stands apart from these other parallels in that it involves not just narrative similarity, but the preservation of a linguistic feature that only makes sense in Sumerian, strongly suggesting direct transmission of this specific motif from Sumerian to Hebrew tradition, through some pathway that preserved the narrative element while losing the wordplay that originally explained it. Alternative scholarly positions have questioned whether this connection represents genuine literary borrowing, or whether it might reflect coincidental convergence of independent traditions addressing similar themes through similar symbolic vocabulary. Some researchers argue that the rib as source of woman could emerge independently in different cultures as a way of expressing ideas about relationship, companionship, and the derivative nature of woman from man in patriarchal societies, without requiring literary influence from Sumerian sources. They note that ribs surround and protect vital organs, particularly the heart, potentially creating symbolic associations with intimacy, protection, and closeness that could independently generate similar imagery in different cultures. However, the specific combination of rib creation and designation as life-giver, coupled with the broader constellation of paradise motifs that appear in both Sumerian and Hebrew traditions, creates a pattern that most scholars find difficult to attribute purely to coincidence. The geographical and temporal proximity of Mesopotamian and Israelite civilizations, the documented circulation of cuneiform texts throughout the ancient Near East, including areas where Israelite culture developed, and the demonstrated influence of Mesopotamian literature on other contemporary cultures create plausible contexts for transmission that make direct influence more likely than independent parallel development of such specific correspondences. The scholarly interpretation of this connection remains contested. Thorkild Jacobson and other specialists in Sumerian literature have noted numerous parallels between the Dilmun paradise myth and the Eden story, the divine paradise described as a garden planted eastward, the fresh water brought up from the earth to irrigate the land, the birth of goddesses without pain or travail, illuminating the background of the curse against Eve, that it shall be her lot to conceive and bear children in sorrow, Enki's eating of the 8 plants and the curse uttered against him for his misdeed, recalling the eating of the fruit of the tree of knowledge by Adam and Eve, and the curses pronounced against each of them for this sinful action, and most specifically, the connection between the rib and the one who makes live explaining Eve's title, and her being fashioned from Adam's rib. Alternative scholarly positions argue that these parallels represent common mythological themes, rather than direct literary borrowing, that the rib connection may be coincidental, that the theological frameworks differ too substantially to support direct influence, or that both traditions draw on older common sources now lost. The geographical and temporal separation between Sumerian Dilmun myths and Hebrew Genesis composition, spanning potentially a millennium or more, raises questions about transmission mechanisms and the preservation of specific narrative details across such temporal distance. Scholar Marjo Corpel has proposed that these traditions may have been mediated through Canaanite literature, citing another story with similar characters and events discovered on several Ugaritic cuneiform tablets from the late 13th century BCE. According to Corpel's analysis, these tablets, which place the main god El on Mount Ararat, identified in some traditions as the mountain where Noah settled, may represent an intermediary stage in transmission. This would suggest a chain of cultural contact from Sumerian to Akkadian to Ugaritic to Hebrew, with each cultural context adapting the received traditions to local theological frameworks and literary conventions, though the specific mechanisms and pathways of transmission remain subjects of ongoing scholarly investigation. The evidence indicates that while many prehistoric ancient stories survived into later periods, none were retold intact. Different versions of identical ancient stories were likely introduced over centuries and millennia, influenced by the unique factors of specific geographical locations and historical periods. The question facing scholars involves determining which similarities indicate direct literary borrowing, which reflect common cultural memory of actual events, which represent universal mythological themes appearing independently in different cultures, and which result from complex chains of transmission and adaptation across multiple intermediary cultures. The examination of these creation and paradise narratives reveals patterns that extend beyond isolated textual parallels to encompass systematic structural correspondences suggesting sustained cultural contact and literary influence between Mesopotamian and Hebrew traditions. The Sumerian king list, discovered in fragmentary form during Hermann Hilprecht's excavations at Nippur in the early 1900s, and subsequently found in at least 18 different versions from sites including Babylon, Susa, Assyria, and the Royal Library of Nineveh, provides chronological framework linking creation traditions to historical consciousness in ancient Mesopotamian thought. The list records rulers from antediluvian dynasties through historical periods, presenting itself as a comprehensive account identifying every king in Sumerian history from the primordial descent of kingship from the divine realm through various dynastic successions that mark the political histories of early Mesopotamia. The most complete, extant version, the Weld Blundell prism housed in the Ashmolean Museum at Oxford University, stands approximately 8 inches in height and contains 4 sides with 2 columns inscribed on each face of the octagonal prism. The object was designed with a perforation through its centre, originally accommodating a wooden spindle that would allow the prism to be rotated, enabling readers to access all 4 sides sequentially, suggesting it served as a reference document consulted for chronological and genealogical information. The prism was probably discovered during the 921 excavation season at Larsa in southern Mesopotamia, though its precise find spot within the ancient city remains uncertain due to incomplete excavation records from that period. Dating analysis based on orthographic features of the cuneiform script, the historical content's endpoint, and archaeological context places this particular copy to the Eisen dynasty period, approximately 2017 to 1794 BCE, though this composition itself draws on traditions understood by its compilers to extend much further back in time. The text represents not a contemporary historical record, but rather a retrospective attempt to create comprehensive chronology from materials including earlier king lists, dynastic traditions, and mythological narratives about primordial times, woven together into a unified account serving both historiographic and political functions. The prism begins with the programmatic statement. When kingship descended from heaven, the kingship was in Eridu, immediately establishing a theological framework for understanding political authority as divine in origin, rather than purely human institution. This formulation reflects Mesopotamian political theology where kingship represents a divine gift bestowed on humanity to enable ordered civilization, with specific cities receiving this gift at particular moments through divine decision. The designation of Eridu as the first recipient carries particular significance, as Eridu held status in Sumerian tradition as the oldest city, the dwelling place of Enki-wa-Ea, the god of wisdom and fresh water, and the site where civilization itself began through divine instruction. Following this opening, the king list proceeds to enumerate rulers of Eridu, providing names and reign lengths for kings who ruled before the catastrophic flood that marks the fundamental watershed in Mesopotamian historical conception. The antediluvian section describes 8 to 10 kings, the exact number varying across different manuscript witnesses, who reigned before the deluge. These rulers receive reign lengths measured in Sumerian numerical units known as sars, units of 300-600 years, nairs, units of years, and sosses, units of 60 years, creating totals that far exceed normal human lifespans, and suggest that the compilers understood these figures as representing either divine or semi-divine beings, whose existence operated according to different temporal scales than ordinary humanity, or alternatively that the numbers encode some other form of information not immediately apparent to modern readers. The specific numbers attributed to individual antediluvian rulers demonstrate both the systematic character of the tradition and its extraordinary nature. Alulim, designated as the first king of Eridu, ruled for 28 to 800 years according to the most common manuscript tradition. His successor Al-Aljar ruled for 36,000 years. Enmenlu-Ana of Bad Tibira, the second city to receive kingship after Eridu, ruled for 43,200 years. Enmengal-Ana ruled for 28 to 800 years. Dumuzid, identified as the shepherd, ruled for 36,000 years. The pattern continues through the remaining antediluvian rulers until the total years attributed to these pre-flood kings, when summed across all reign lengths, amounts to 241,200 years according to most versions, though some manuscript variants provide slightly different totals due to textual corruption or deliberate revision by later scribes. Mainstream archaeological interpretation treats these figures as mythological constructs designed to emphasize the importance and antiquity of pre-flood rulers within the Mesopotamian historical imagination. The operating principle appears to be that longer reigns indicate greater significance, with the extraordinary temporal extensions serving to magnify the status of these primordial kings who existed in a different order of reality than their historical successors. This interpretation aligns with broader patterns in ancient Near Eastern literature, where mythological time operates according to different rules than historical time, with primordial events unfolding across temporal scales that dwarf ordinary human experience. None of the pre-dynastic antediluvian rulers listed have been verified as historical figures through archaeological excavations, epigraphical inscriptions discovered at contemporary sites, or other independent evidence that would confirm their existence outside literary tradition. The names appear exclusively in the king list tradition and related Sumerian literary texts, suggesting they represent either purely legendary figures or possibly historical individuals whose actual identities and accomplishments have been transformed beyond recognition through centuries of oral and written transmission. Some scholars have proposed that these kings may correspond loosely to rulers of the early Bronze Age Jemdet Nasr period culture, which ended approximately 2900 BCE, immediately preceding the early dynastic period when documented historical kings begin to appear, though this correlation remains speculative and lacks firm evidential support. Alternative interpretations, particularly among scholars attempting to correlate Mesopotamian and biblical chronologies, note structural parallels between the antediluvian kings of the Sumerian king list and the antediluvian patriarchs of Genesis 5. Both lists record 10 figures, in most versions living before a catastrophic flood. Both attribute extraordinarily long lifespans to these figures, though the specific numbers differ substantially. Both serve to connect primordial creation to historical consciousness through genealogical frameworks. Research by scholars including R.K. Harrison in 1993 identified what they interpret as a potential numerical relationship between the two lists, though this interpretation remains highly controversial within mainstream scholarship. The analysis notes that when the kingdom durations of the antediluvian section are expressed in sexagesimal, basis in the 60 notation, certain numerical patterns emerge. A tally of the ciphers used yields 6 10-602 signs, 6 602 signs, and 60 signs. If the biblical patriarchal ages were similarly analysed using decimal notation, and their sum was mistakenly read as sexagesimal, some correspondence in structure could be argued, though this would require multiple assumptions about scribal error and textual transmission. This hypothesis, which proposes that a Sumerian scribe had access to a document containing numerical information on patriarchal ages, similar to Genesis, and mistakenly interpreted decimal notation as sexagesimal, remains rejected by most specialists as speculative. Critics note that the conversion requires selective reading of texts, assumes unverified scribal errors, relies on models of textual transmission lacking archaeological support, and attributes extraordinary significance to numerical coincidences that may be coincidental given the limited range of ancient numbering systems. The structural parallel between 10 antediluvian figures in both traditions preceding a catastrophic flood is acknowledged as potentially significant, but whether this indicates direct literary relationship, common cultural memory, or coincidental development of similar genealogical frameworks remains contested. What appears established is that Mesopotamian traditions documenting extraordinarily long-lived antediluvian rulers culminating in a catastrophic flood that marks a transition from primordial to historical time, predate biblical Genesis by centuries at minimum. The Sumerian king list in its current form dates to the Ur 30 period, circa 2100 BCE, though it records traditions understood to be older. The antediluvian section has been found as a separate entity in a tablet dated to the end of the 3rd millennium BCE, without reference to lists of other rulers, suggesting independent circulation of this tradition before incorporation into the comprehensive king list. The literary formula used in the antediluvian section differs from that used in the post-diluvian sections of the king list, supporting the theory that different traditions with different origins were combined by later scribes. Phrases and information in the antediluvian section have been found in a Sumerian epic dealing with the beginning of the world, with close correspondence between common phrases and identical ordering of primeval cities, indicating literary interdependence between these texts. The pattern emerging from examination of multiple Mesopotamian creation and pre-flood traditions suggests a complex literary environment in which various creation accounts, paradise narratives, antediluvian genealogies, and flood stories circulated independently before being collected, combined, and systematized by later scribes into more comprehensive compositions. This same process of collection and systematization appears to have occurred in biblical tradition, where multiple creation accounts, Genesis chapter 1 and Genesis 2-3, differ significantly in order and emphasis. Genealogies and flood narratives were combined into the unified Genesis narrative. The question of literary relationship extends beyond simple comparison of individual motifs to encompass analysis of compositional techniques, editorial practices, and the cultural context within which these texts functioned. The Enuma Elish, the Babylonian creation epic dated to the late 2nd millennium BCE and recovered by English archaeologist Austin Henry Layard in 1849 in fragmentary form from the ruined library of Ashurbanipal at Nineveh, provides additional perspective on Mesopotamian creation traditions and their potential relationship to Genesis. The epic was first published by English Assyriologist George Smith in 1876, with active research and further excavations leading to near completion of the texts and improved translation in subsequent decades. Enuma Elish contains about 1,000 lines recorded in Akkadian on 7 clay tablets, each holding between 115 and 150 lines of cuneiform script. Most of Tablet 5 has never been recovered, but aside from this lacuna, the text is almost complete. The composition describes the creation of the world through conflict between gods, focused particularly on the offering of supreme power to Marduk, the patron deity of Babylon, in exchange for his defeat of the primordial chaos monster Tiamat. Superficial similarities between Enuma Elish and Genesis have led some scholars to propose direct influence. Both organize creation into sequential stages. Both involve initial darkness followed by light. Both describe the creation of the firmament separating waters. Both include the creation of dry land. Both culminate in the creation of humanity. Both conclude with a period of rest, though in Enuma Elish this involves the gods resting after their labours, while in Genesis God rests on the seventh day. Closer examination reveals that these similarities prove less significant than initial observation suggests. The 6-7 day structure of Genesis creation finds no real parallel in Enuma Elish, which does not organise creation according to numbered days. The order of creation events differs substantially between the two accounts. Most critically, the theological frameworks remain fundamentally incompatible. Enuma Elish presents creation emerging from conflicts between generations of gods, with the universe fashioned from the corpse of the defeated chaos goddess Tiamat. Genesis presents creation as the purposeful act of a singular god speaking order into existence without conflict or pre-existing materials. Alexander Heidel's detailed comparative analysis demonstrated that the dissimilarities between the two texts outweigh the similarities. First, Genesis teaches monotheism while Enuma Elish teaches polytheism, with Mesopotamian myths describing a pantheon of deities who act like corrupt and merciless humans, while Genesis depicts only one creator whose creation is declared very good. Second, Genesis depicts God as self-existent, while Enuma Elish states that the gods themselves were contingent, emerging from sexual union or conflict among earlier divine beings. After the Mesopotamian gods emerge, the universe springs from the war or sexual congress of gods and goddesses, with creation ascribed to sexual congress in Heidel's analysis. Third, Enuma Elish portrays creation arising from conflict and violence, with the first 4 tablets dealing almost exclusively with the contest between Marduk and Tiamat and the events leading up to it, while the creation story proper occupies less than 2 tablets. Genesis 1-2 contains no conflict whatsoever, only God's peaceful and purposeful creation. Fourth, in Genesis, God creates by divine word. God speaks and creation occurs as expressed in Psalm 33, 6-9. By the word of the Lord the heavens were made, and all their host by the breath of his mouth. For he spoke, and it came to. Be, he commanded, and it stood firm. The Mesopotamian deities had no such power, with Heidel noting that the word of the Babylonian deities was not almighty. Fifth, Genesis describes the sun, moon and stars as mere creations, while Enuma Elish considered these to be gods. Heidel notes that in Enuma Elish, the luminary bodies and their purposes in astronomical terms were interwoven with mythology, diametrically opposed to the Hebrew worldview, which forbade the worship of the sun and the moon and the stars, as stated in Deuteronomy 4:19. Sixth, the purpose of human creation differs fundamentally. In Enuma Elish, humanity is created from the blood of a rebellious god to serve the victorious gods in perpetuity. In Genesis, humanity is created in the image of God, blessed with dominion, and called to relationship rather than servitude. These differences suggest that while Mesopotamian creation traditions may have influenced the cultural context within which Hebrew creation narratives developed, the biblical account represents a radical theological transformation of received motifs rather than simple borrowing or adaptation. The monotheistic framework, the moral dimension of creation and fall, the dignity accorded to humanity, and the purposeful rather than utilitarian understanding of human existence mark Genesis as fundamentally distinct from its Mesopotamian context despite sharing certain narrative patterns and motifs. The question remains, how do these undeniable parallels in narrative structure coexist with fundamental differences in theological content? Several explanatory models have been proposed by scholars working across the disciplines of Assyriology, biblical studies, comparative religion, and ancient Near Eastern history. The cultural diffusion module proposes that Mesopotamian creation traditions spread westward through trade, migration, and cultural contact, reaching Canaan and eventually influencing Hebrew tradition during either the 2nd millennium BCE through Canaanite mediation or during the Babylonian exile in the 6th century BCE through direct contact. Under this model, Hebrew scribes consciously adapted Mesopotamian narratives, transforming polytheistic creation accounts into monotheistic theology, while preserving certain narrative structures and motifs that had achieved wide cultural currency. Evidence supporting this model includes the documented influence of Mesopotamian culture on Canaan during the Bronze Age, the presence of cuneiform tablets at sites throughout the Levant, including Ugarit and Amarna, the training of scribes in Mesopotamian literary traditions, and the historical reality of the Babylonian exile, creating circumstances for direct Hebrew exposure to Mesopotamian literature. The transformation of received traditions through theological reinterpretation finds parallels in how various cultures adapted Mesopotamian literary materials, including the Hittites who incorporated Mesopotamian myths while adapting them to Anatolian contexts. The common source model proposes that both Mesopotamian and Hebrew creation traditions derive from older, now lost traditions that predate both civilizations, with each culture preserving and developing different aspects of this common heritage. Under this model, similarities result not from direct borrowing, but from shared cultural memory extending back to some original tradition or actual historical experience. Differences result from independent development and theological evolution in separate cultural contexts over centuries or millennia. Evidence cited for this model includes the presence of flood narratives in geographically isolated cultures worldwide, suggesting common human memory of catastrophic events, and the archaeological evidence for severe flooding in Mesopotamia circa 2900 BCE that could have generated cultural memories preserved in various traditions. Critics note that this model requires speculation about hypothetical lost, sources without concrete evidence, and that worldwide flood narratives may reflect independent responses to universal human experiences of catastrophic weather events rather than shared memory of a single historical occurrence. The archetypal themes model proposes that certain narrative patterns and mythological motifs emerge independently in different cultures because they address universal human questions about origins, mortality, suffering, and relationship to the divine. Under this model, similarities between Mesopotamian and Hebrew creation accounts result not from literary borrowing or common sources, but from parallel development of similar narrative solutions to similar existential questions. Evidence supporting this model includes the cross-cultural appearance of creation myths involving primordial chaos, divine speech or action bringing order, the special creation of humanity, and explanations for mortality and suffering. However, the specific parallels between Mesopotamian and Hebrew traditions, including unique motifs like the rib connection and the specific narrative of forbidden food in paradise, prove more difficult to explain through independent parallel development than through some form of literary relationship or cultural contact. The synthetic model, increasingly favoured by contemporary scholars, proposes that all three mechanisms operated simultaneously. Hebrew creation narratives developed within a broader ancient Near Eastern cultural context where Mesopotamian traditions circulated widely, providing narrative templates and motifs that Hebrew scribes adapted while also drawing on their own cultural traditions and consciously reformulating received materials through theological transformation to express distinctive monotheistic convictions. This model acknowledges both chronological priority and literary borrowing while recognizing the creative theological work it has evolved in transforming polytheistic narratives into monotheistic frameworks. Under the synthetic model, the Genesis creation and fall narrative represents conscious engagement with Mesopotamian literary traditions, selective borrowing of effective narrative motifs, radical theological reinterpretation through monotheistic lenses, and purposeful construction of an alternative creation account that challenges Mesopotamian theological assumptions while operating within recognizable literary conventions. The result is a text that shares structural and narrative features with Mesopotamian antecedents while expressing fundamentally different understandings of divine nature, cosmic order, and human purpose. The scholarly debate continues because the evidence permits multiple readings. An honest assessment requires acknowledging the limitations of current understanding. Multiple interpretive frameworks explain different aspects of the evidence well, while struggling with other aspects. The religious interpretation accounts for the administrative precision and archaeological correlations, but faces challenges, explaining the cosmic language and theological framework. The historical interpretation provides context for specific procedural details, but struggles to account for the theological sophistication and literary artistry. Each framework illuminates certain dimensions while leaving others in shadow. Significant questions remain unresolved. The archaeological evidence for the late Bronze Age and early Iron Age periods, when direct contact between Mesopotamian and Israelite cultures would most likely have facilitated literary transmission, suffers from incomplete excavation coverage. Many relevant sites remain unexcavated or only partially explored, limiting understanding of the geographic extent and uniformity of cultural contact. Approximately 60% of relevant tablet series remains unpublished or inadequately translated, residing in museum collections awaiting analysis, with new discoveries and improved translations regularly revealing previously unrecognized connections or distinctions. The methodological limitations in dating biblical texts create uncertainty about when Genesis achieved its current form and under what circumstances. Proposals for Genesis composition range from Mosaic authorship in the late 2nd millennium BCE to post-exilic compilation in the 6th to 5th centuries BCE, with implications for understanding potential Mesopotamian influence. Earlier dating would require indirect transmission through Canaanite intermediaries, while later dating would allow for direct contact during the exile, creating different scenarios for how literary borrowing might have occurred. Future research directions include systematic re-examination of excavation records from early 20th century expeditions using modern stratigraphic methods, completion of textual publication and translation projects for relevant tablet series, application of advanced dating and analytical techniques to artifacts from crucial periods, and comparative analysis across the broader ancient Near Eastern region to identify patterns and regional variations in creation traditions. Recent developments in digital humanities methodologies, allowing computational analysis of textual parallels and transmission patterns, offer potential for fresh approaches to questions of literary relationship. The textual evidence from Mesopotamian creation narratives, examined systematically across the Eridu Genesis, the Atrahasis epic, the Adapa myth, the Enki and Ninhursag paradise tradition, the Sumerian king list and related compositions, demonstrates beyond reasonable scholarly dispute that sophisticated narratives describing divine creation of humanity, placement in paradisiacal settings, tests involving consumption, determination of mortality, and catastrophic floods predated biblical Genesis by centuries and, in some cases, by over a millennium. These narratives achieved wide distribution throughout Mesopotamia and influenced neighbouring cultures through various transmission mechanisms documented in the archaeological and textual record. The tablets from Nippur, Eridu, Sippar, Nineveh, and related sites preserve accounts that resist simple categorization. Too detailed for pure mythology, too cosmic for pure history, they occupy an ambiguous space between genres that challenges modern interpretive frameworks designed for texts that fit more clearly into conventional categories. The difficulty lies not necessarily in the ancient texts, but in modern expectations about how ancient peoples understood and described their world. The boundaries between religious expression, historical memory, and institutional record may have been more fluid in ancient Mesopotamia than modern scholarship generally assumes. The patterns revealed through examination of these materials extend beyond questions of literary borrowing to encompass fundamental issues about how civilizations understand and represent their own origins. The Mesopotamian scribes who preserved these accounts operated within cultural frameworks and knowledge systems fundamentally different from modern academic scholarship, yet they too grappled with questions of meaning, memory, and transmission across generations. Their tablets preserve not just information, but the intellectual efforts of earlier scholars attempting to make sense of their inherited traditions and observed realities. The relationship between these Mesopotamian creation traditions and the biblical Genesis account remains complex and contested. Chronological priority of Mesopotamian texts is established through archaeological evidence. Cultural contact between Mesopotamian and Hebrew traditions is documented through historical records and material culture. Specific narrative parallels, including the rib motif, the Paradise Garden, forbidden consumption, and antediluvian genealogies, prove too numerous and too specific to dismiss as coincidental. Yet the theological transformations evident in Genesis, converting polytheistic frameworks into monotheistic theology, replacing utilitarian anthropology with dignity-based understanding of humanity, and introducing moral dimensions absent from Mesopotamian accounts, demonstrate creative theological work beyond simple adaptation. The accumulated evidence appears most consistent with a model involving cultural transmission, selective adaptation, and theological transformation occurring across centuries through multiple intermediary stages and cultural contexts, though the precise mechanisms remain debated. Hebrew scribes appear to have engaged with Mesopotamian literary traditions incorporating recognizable narrative structures while substantially reimagining their theological content to express distinctive convictions about divine nature and human purpose. The result is a text that operates within ancient Near Eastern literary conventions, while articulating fundamentally different religious and philosophical commitments. Contemporary research continues adding detail to this picture, while simultaneously revealing additional complexity. Each new excavation, each new translation, each new analytical technique contributes to more nuanced understanding of ancient achievement and its place in human history. The trajectory of scholarship suggests not movement toward simple answers, but progression toward more sophisticated comprehension of how ancient cultures developed, preserved, and transmitted foundational narratives about human origins and divine purpose across generations and geographical distances. The tablets remain, preserved in museum collections across continents, offering their testimony to any willing to engage with their complexity. They speak of ancient scribes pondering ultimate questions about where humans came from, why mortality characterizes human existence, what relationship humans bear to divine powers, and how cosmic order emerged from primordial chaos. These questions transcend particular cultural contexts, while receiving culturally specific answers shaped by the theological commitments and literary conventions of each tradition. The examination of Mesopotamian creation narratives reveals both the antiquity of human theological reflection and the enduring nature of fundamental questions about existence. The precise relationship between these ancient Mesopotamian accounts and the biblical Genesis narrative may never be fully resolved to universal scholarly satisfaction, given the fragmentary nature of textual evidence, the uncertainties surrounding transmission mechanisms, and the interpretive challenges posed by radically different cultural contexts separated by millennia. What emerges clearly from the accumulated evidence is that the questions addressed in Genesis chapter 11 about human origins, divine purpose, mortality, suffering, and catastrophe were questions that preoccupied Mesopotamian civilization for over 2,000 years before biblical composition, generating sophisticated literary responses preserved on clay tablets that modern archaeology has recovered from the ruins of ancient cities. These Mesopotamian answers, expressed through polytheistic frameworks emphasizing divine conflict and human servitude, provided narrative templates and literary motifs that influenced the broader ancient Near Eastern cultural sphere within which Hebrew tradition developed. The biblical Genesis account, while operating within this shared cultural context and employing recognizable literary conventions, represents a theological revolution that transformed received narratives through monotheistic reimagining. The result preserves structural echoes of Mesopotamian antecedents while articulating radically different convictions about divine nature, cosmic order, and human dignity. This combination of cultural continuity and theological innovation characterizes much of biblical literature, which consistently engages ancient Near Eastern traditions while transcending them through prophetic transformation. The scholarly conversation surrounding these texts continues because the evidence resists reduction to simple explanations and demands ongoing engagement with new discoveries and methodological refinement. The tablets preserved in museum collections from Philadelphia to London and to Baghdad represent not just ancient documents but living questions about how humanity has understood its origins, its relationship to the divine, and its place in cosmic order. These questions remain vital not despite but because of their antiquity, connecting modern inquiry to concerns that preoccupied our earliest literate ancestors in the cities of ancient Mesopotamia 4,000 years ago.